Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Sean Rogers, and I'm with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before turning the webinar over to today's featured presenters, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housecleaning items about how the webinar is going to work, and then take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about the National Reentry Resource Center. Anytime during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We will keep a running list of the content-related questions that we receive and then ask the panelists to respond to the questions during the last segment of the webinar. We will do our best to get through as many of the questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve. For this reason, we are recording this event and we will post it on our website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. We should have the webinar posted online early next week, and once it has been posted, we will email you a link to the recording. The National Reentry Resource Center, established by the Second Chance Act and administered by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance, provides education, training, and technical assistance to states, tribes, territories, local governments, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and corrections institutions working on prisoner reentry. It is a project of the Council of State Governments Justice Center with key project partners including the Urban Institute, Association of State Correctional Administrators, and the American Probation and Parole Association. The center is also guided by an advisory board which helps coordinate support and services for Second Chance Act grantees and the reentry field at large. Its overall mission is to advance the reentry field through knowledge transfer and dissemination and to promote evidence-based practices. This slide provides a snapshot of the Resource Center's home page. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC after today's webinar. Before we get started with today's presentations, I'd like to quickly take a minute to tell you about a couple of CSG Justice Center projects. The first is the Reentry and Employment Project. The purpose of this project is to provide policymakers and practitioners with resources and tools to improve reentry and employment outcomes for individuals recently released from prisons and jails. To that end, the Justice Center recently released a white paper titled Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies, Reducing Recidivism and Promoting Job Readiness. In addition, tomorrow the Justice Center is hosting an event in Washington, D.C. that will feature officials from the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration and officials from the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. This forum will happen from 9 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, and the Justice Center will live stream the event in its entirety and then replay the event throughout the day tomorrow on the Justice Center's website. You can watch the live stream, download the recently released paper, and learn more about the project, all from the link that appears on your screen right now. Another of the Justice Center's recent and notable endeavors is the What Works in Reentry Clearinghouse, which was developed in partnership with the Urban Institute. It provides you with easily accessible information about the research on topics related to reentry programs and practice. To check it out, click on the What Works tab on the National Reentry Resource Center's homepage. With that, I'd now like to turn the webinar over to Nathan Lowe from the American Probation and Parole Association, who will serve as the moderator for today's webinar. Nathan?
All right. Thank you, Sean. Before we turn it over to the other panelists, I'd like to just for those of you who are unfamiliar with APPA, give you a little information about APPA, American Probation Parole Association. As mentioned, is also known as APPA, International Association composed of individuals actively involved with probation, parole, and community-based corrections in both adult and juvenile sectors. Over the years, APPA has grown to become the voice for thousands of probation and parole practitioners. Educators, volunteers, and concerned citizens with an interest in criminal and juvenile justice are also among APPA's members. By continuing to effectively provide services to its constituents, APPA represents a strong, unified voice for the field of community corrections. Please visit the APPA website, as shown on this slide, for more information about our specialized training, current projects, and forthcoming Winter Training Institute to be held January 2014 in Houston, Texas. We sure hope to see you there. So let me now briefly introduce our speakers for today's training session. First, Dr. Faith Lukes is an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Washington State University. She will provide both a theoretical and practical framework for understanding neighborhood-based supervision, also known as NBS, in addition to a discussion about the research she has conducted in this area. In addition, Scott Bauer is the Director of Operations Support for the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole. Scott will be talking with us about the concept of virtual offices that have been integrated in the parole supervision process in Georgia in recent years. While I will allow Scott to provide you with the details, such offices allow for community supervision in the areas where offenders live, work, and socialize. Lastly, Faith wanted to formally recognize her colleague, Dr. Lori Trapella, for her contribution to the intellectual content of this webinar. We were fortunate to have Lori involved with us at a training workshop we conducted on this very same topic a few months ago at the APPA Annual Training Institute in Baltimore. So let's quickly review the learning objectives of today's session. As mentioned, I will first provide a definition of neighborhood-based supervision, or NBS. This will ensure that we are all working under the same definition for the purpose of understanding the content of today's webinar. Next, as mentioned a moment ago, Faith will provide a framework for theoretical and practical implications of NBS, while also discussing the research around this topic, including the work she has done. Finally, Scott will discuss policy and practice implications of what they have done in Georgia, again, with the concept of virtual offices and some other initiatives and some endeavors they've been working on in recent years. So what is NBS? Well, it involves really three underlying components. The first, it deals with supervision offices located within close proximity of where parolees reside in the community. It really is a matter of strategically placing offices or officers in areas where a majority of parolees live, work, and socialize. So that's the first component. It also involves the establishment of partnerships between criminal justice agencies and other community organizations. Such partnerships attempt to proactively ensure the successful reintegration and parolees back into the community. And then lastly, and possibly most importantly, NBS involves the community and the supervision process, allowing the public to take ownership, or at least some ownership, and responsibility for the successful reentry of offenders. The community's role in NBS is imperative to its success. There must be support and involvement by the community in order to have effective supervision practices. And both Faith and Scott will individually talk about the importance of these components as they relate to successful supervision practices and neighborhood-based supervision altogether. So now at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Faith for her portion of the presentation. Faith?
Thank you, Nathan. I appreciate that introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, and I appreciate your interest in neighborhood supervision and corrections of place. And so what I want to start off doing is really talking about how all three aspects of corrections, community corrections, as well as community as well as officers, and then offender-centered corrections work. And I'm sorry, but Sean, I'm having trouble forwarding the slide, so I'm sorry for this interruption.
That's all right. Okay. Let me see if I can advance it for you.
Okay.
There.
Okay.
I'll just advance the slide throughout your presentation. You just say next slide, and I'll advance it.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Sean. Okay, so what this figure indicates is that a lot of our emphasis in community corrections, and rightly so, is oftentimes focused solely on the offender. It's our primary focus. And I will refer to this as offender-centered reentry throughout the presentation. And what we do when we put offenders at the center is we focus on their risk, need, and responsivity. We focus on what kinds of evidence-based practice and treatments are best applied to offenders and focus on offenders. And we focus on different types of supervision, so surveillance, whether we emphasize monitoring and tracking people, as well as providing support and treatment. But all of that is encompassed within really placing the offender at the center. But as everyone knows who works with offenders, whether in prisons or in the community, every offender goes back to a community. And oftentimes, those communities are very difficult places to achieve success. So no matter what kinds of very effective things we do at the offender-centered approach in terms of treatment and surveillance and monitoring and support, what often happens is all of that gets eroded when the offender returns to a community, especially communities that are oftentimes disadvantaged. And so we acknowledge that, but we oftentimes do not then think about, well, what can we do in the community, for the community, that might build a foundation and a place for offenders to return that enhances their success instead of erodes their success. And then something that, as a researcher, I've discovered oftentimes in the literature and the research is that community corrections officers are very often invisible. So in Washington, we call probation and parole officers community corrections officers. So you will hear me refer to probation and parole officers as community corrections officers. But what we do is we obviously understand the importance of effective community corrections officers and the importance of their expertise and their experience in supervising offenders. But oftentimes they're invisible when we're talking about evidence-based treatments. They're oftentimes hidden in centralized offices, kind of behind the lobbies of where offenders report. And oftentimes when they're in the community, they're not visible unless they are traveling with police and so forth. And so what I want to talk about in this presentation and what we know in terms of research is the importance of community to successful reintegration and supporting the success of the work of community corrections officers as we move forward. So if I could see the next slide, please. So when we talk of corrections of place, what we're really talking about is shifting from an offender-centered approach where we only look at the offender to a community-centered approach where we really think about the offender integrating into a network within a community and the informal and the formal social controls that then apply to that offender. And the emphasis is always on community safety. So how can we look at both the offender and the community to enhance that safety? Next slide. On the next slide, what you'll see is a quote from Joe Lehman, who is a former secretary of the Washington State Department of Corrections. And he was the one at the time who was supportive of implementing neighborhood-based supervision. And one of the things that he basically argued was that becoming relationally focused as opposed to offender-centered means that new ways of supervising and working with offenders in the communities must be invented. And so what happened then is really kind of an attempt at a philosophical shift that supervision alone in terms of using surveillance and monitoring is effective in some situations with some offenders, but in general the research shows that we really need a more fluid approach that's inclusive of the community and other community stakeholders in sharing the responsibility for the success of offenders in our neighborhoods, our cities, and our broader communities. So in the next slide, then we have to ask, what is community? There are three working definitions of community. One is geographic location. And so that's, as we think about it, it's the borders and boundaries that define place by location. So they may be defined by economic status, by race, ethnicity, by tradition in terms of neighborhood, blocks, and zones. So it really is a spatial definition of community. But there's also, in the literature, community is thought of much more complexly. So what are all of the social and kinship networks that people are connected to? So that includes who are the individuals in terms of peers and family members and neighborhood or neighbors, businesses, churches, all those things that people are connected to within the communities that they live. And then the third definition is functional. And this definition really combines both of the other two definitions. So it generally is geographic location, but it's also about who actually comes in contact with the offender in the community. So who are those kind of extra legals? And that's the criminal justice system in terms of police and courts and corrections. But who, in terms of their natural environment, actually interacts on a day-to-day basis with the offender. So in the next slide, what we see as important elements of community. So once we kind of move through that definition, is what aspects of community then can probation and parole utilize to affect change with offenders? And so what are the elements within communities that they should be targeting and drawing upon? Well, what this research shows us is that there's two very important attributes of community. One is social capital. Social capital basically is the ability of actors to secure benefits by virtue of membership in social networks and structures. So what that basically means is who has the ability to leverage resources within a community, right? Collective advocacy refers to linkages between people, so mutual trust and a shared willingness to intervene for the common good. So once again, social capital is what are the resources available within that community, and then collective advocacy is what is the willingness of people to come together for a common cause or a common good. So on the next slide, what you'll see is a quote that I collected while conducting research in Spokane, Washington. And why I include this quote is because we can talk about the technical attributes of community and the definition of community, but what does that mean when it translates into the actual workday of a probation or parole officer? And so the honesty within this quote is insightful. And so this officer says, how do I define community? I don't have a definition for community, and kind of laughs. I don't give my job a lot of thought other than to come in and to deal with whatever fires need to be put out for that particular day. I don't usually sit down and work out philosophy or definitions of community or anything else. And so what this quote demonstrates is that, yeah, community may be important, but when I have a large caseload and I have high-risk offenders and I'm responsible for the well-being of the community in terms of monitoring and interacting with this person in a way that they do not do further harm, it's really hard to move past an offender-centered approach because of it means adding to one's day in terms of interacting with the community and stakeholders and all of that. And so what I want to move to now is to talk about, well, how can that happen? How can we think about corrections of place and neighborhood-based supervision in a way that's conducive to the concerns expressed by this community corrections officer in Washington? And so if we go to the next slide, what we know through research and through practical experience is that it's common for over 30 to 50% of inmates in any particular state to be returned to a single city. So usually that's a state's largest urban center, one or two, whatever exists within particular states. And then what we also know is that, offenders returned to the community from prison is not randomly distributed across the city. It's usually highly concentrated. In larger cities, 1/3 return to only 5 or 6 neighborhoods. And that return is to the same environment that usually compromises the likelihood of success. So it's the same environment that they originated from and then are returned to. To put this in real terms, in the city of Chicago, for instance, over 5,000 inmates are returned to only 6 of 77 communities every year. So in a single year, 5,000 inmates are released from prison to only 6 neighborhoods or communities out of 77 across the city in a single year. So the necessity of a place-based approach becomes evident when we see that the primary population being supervised is really concentrated within very specific neighborhoods within a city. So on the next slide, and where I'm going to move forward, is why corrections of place. And so what we know is that through all of the research in criminology, we know that informal social controls are much more effective than formal social controls. So all those things that happen in the community outside of the criminal justice system are much more effective in controlling behavior than many of the things that we do as organizations within criminal justice. And so how do we take that formal control that happens within the system and integrate it with and enhance those informal social controls to create change? We also know that when we focus on place and the resources within places, even in some of our most disadvantaged communities, we see significant improvements in short and long-term outcomes for offenders. So our likelihood of achieving long-term integration is enhanced. And then also what happens when we connect with communities is instead of the entire responsibility of corrections being put upon the criminal justice system, what we see is an enhanced shared responsibility for achieving social control and the reintegration of offenders, so that offenders become a part of the community versus something that is just something to be tolerated within the community. So on the next slide, what we see is that then what is the process? So then how can community corrections, how can probation and parole officers and the organizations in which they work for, how can they enhance that informal social control? And what we see then, if you recall the concept of collective efficacy, so that's a willingness of people to come together to create change. What we see is that collective efficacy refers to the process of informal social control and the social cohesion among residents. And so also the sense of shared expectations. So how can everything that exists within a community build upon the strengths, as well as then organizing to deal with the weaknesses? So what are the shared expectations within communities that probation and parole officers can participate? And I already stated that informal social control is much more effective. So how is it effective? So the next slide shows that there are improved short and long-term outcomes. So strong collective efficacy in a geographic area is associated with lower crime rates. And it also, a lot of what collective efficacy does and the utilization and building of social capital within communities is that it diminishes the intergenerational disadvantage. So what we see when we look at improved collective efficacies within communities is better health outcomes in terms of children's health, education, emotional well-being, increased graduation rates, so kids are more likely to stay in school and be retained throughout the entire process, and reductions in delinquency and adult incarceration over the lifespan. And so what our research tells us is that after decades of research, especially in Chicago by Sampson, that collective efficacy is possible in disadvantaged neighborhoods. So oftentimes we have a tendency to believe there's not much we can do within certain areas, whether they be urban or rural, but our research tells us otherwise. So on the next slide, and once again, kind of following up on, so why corrections a place and how do we engage that as community corrections experts to affect change for the offenders that we're responsible for, is that collective efficacy provides a shared responsibility in which we can increase informal social controls and reintegration. So one way that you do that is through entering relationships among local community organizations. So NGOs are non-governmental organizations, and research shows that they're a critical part of creating and enhancing collective efficacy. And so NGOs often work with government organizations in a shared approach or a partnership in attempting to basically affect change within communities. And so what research shows is that shared expectations, especially with working with NGOs, oftentimes increases community trust and response time to community crisis. And so this partnership between government agencies and NGOs are important. The next slide will show that we often think that the density of social ties, like so the more NGOs and agencies that are available in a community, the better. But what our research is showing us is not necessarily density, but the diversity of social ties among NGOs and citizens that make a difference. So there's not a single type of organization in a neighborhood or a city that establishes or promotes community trust and shared expectations of order, but it's that diversity of social ties. And so as an example, so you may have a number of churches and faith-based organizations within a community and very few other types of NGOs. And that may not be effective because it's a single type of non-government organization versus multiple organizations and diversity within those organizations supporting change and addressing the needs of the community. So the next slide really transitions us to just reiterating that the number of nonprofits and the diversity. And the important part is really the second bullet, which talks about the more interdependent NGOs, the greater the ability to serve the community through goods and services or controlling crime. So what this says is that our agencies that exist in the community, our support services, they need to be working together, right? They're all addressing a piece of it or sharing resources and interdisciplinary knowledge and support to affect that change that is so important to success in terms of probation and parole. But agencies tend to want to reach out to everybody. So when we start talking about interagency collaboration, what often happens is, well, let's go through the phone book and find everybody possible who may have something to do with our offenders. And what happens is that oftentimes overwhelms the agency and may not be working with the people that you should be targeting and targeting resources to. So it's really important to be selective in developing partnerships. So what the next slide indicates is that, so what partners? If it's really not good practice to pick everyone, then what are the attributes you should be looking for in the people or the organizations that you choose to collaborate with who are truly going to have an effect in building that collective efficacy, working with your organization, with your offenders, and with your staff in effective ways? And so what we see here is on the left-hand side is what is their collaborative capacity. So when you're selecting an organization, organizational capacity is what is the strength of the nonprofit's human resources. So do they have the people to actually do what they say they're going to do for our offenders? Do they have that capacity to make it happen? Do they have the programmatic capacity? So when we talk about evidence-based practice and evidence-based treatment, we need to know that the agencies we're working with, nonprofits, or non-governmental organizations as well as governmental organizations that we may partner, do they actually have the ability to plan and implement and do it well and effectively or not? And if they don't, then they're not a good partner because they're going to encounter your offenders, but they're not going to actually serve them in a way that's going to be meaningful. Do they have the resource capacity? So the ability to obtain and manage their physical resources, network capacity. Do they have relationships with other key stakeholders that are going to make things happen? And political capacity, the ability to mobilize support in terms of missions and goals and for stakeholders in the community. And so by aligning with these organizations and partnership, you create effective strategies to move everybody forward in developing the collective efficacy and social capital necessary to affect change for the people living in the neighborhood and in the communities that you're serving through the supervision of offenders. So on the left side are those effective strategies in terms of getting that wide base of community support, making sure you have shared goals and projects, and then cultivating the proper relationships in terms of interacting with government decision makers. So the next slide on how to connect with community organizations, I want to go through in detail in terms of time management here. But basically, it's really important that agency administrators and supervisors activate these connections and share the information that is necessary to give others an understanding of what actually community corrections is. So often, community corrections is just viewed as an extension of the criminal justice system, like there's something other than police, there's something other than prisons, but what do they actually do? How can they actually partner with us? How can they collaborate in a way that isn't just purely coercive, but also supportive and restorative? And so connecting with organizations, not assuming that they know what community corrections is and what community corrections brings to the table and to the community to affect change. On the next slide are some real-world examples. These are broader initiatives that community corrections can join, and these resources are available for you to look up and to get a sense. But you see how these broader initiatives integrate different stakeholders and NGOs along with or parallel to oftentimes formal state institutions to affect change at the neighborhood level. But what I want to spend the end of my presentation on is a specific example within community corrections. So the next slide looks at introducing neighborhood-based supervision in Spokane, Washington. And so basically, in a nutshell, what neighborhood-based supervision does is assigns officers to specific neighborhoods so that officers work directly with that neighborhood. All of their offenders are assigned to that neighborhood or living in that neighborhood in terms of their caseload. But there's an emphasis on not just the caseload being in the neighborhood, but officers working cooperatively with community members and key stakeholders, and officers tailoring interventions to the unique needs of the community that they're serving. Now, neighborhood-based supervision had a unique beginning. As you know, as earlier in the presentation, Joe Lehman basically said that we really need to think about how we interact with offenders and with communities, and we need to be innovative in creating new roles and new relationships within the community. And so that was going on at the state level. But what's happening at the local level in Spokane was a heinous crime in which 2 little girls were murdered. And this really initiated a grassroots movement at the community level, which established cop shops with the Spokane Police Department. And soon after their establishment, the Department of Corrections and Community Corrections specifically asked to become a part of those neighborhood-based, community-oriented policing substations. And so what happened was then is that community corrections officers were placed, their offices were located within those cop shops, and their caseloads then became composed of offenders living in those specific neighborhoods, and shifted from offender-centered to community-centered so that the neighborhood became the client, so to speak. So what the next slide gives is a detailed view of neighborhood-based supervision and their partners. So how did they, at the neighborhood level, bring those 3 things together, the community corrections officer, those state and government institutions with the NGOs, and then with those informal pockets of collective advocacy and social capital that exists at the neighborhood level. And so what you see here is that on the left-hand side in the reddish color column are all those community-driven kind of neighborhood-based NGOs that provide that informal social control that provides support to people. So it's the family, it's the neighbors, it's peers, churches, schools, community groups. In the center, what we see is a little broader than the neighborhood, but more the community city level, okay? And these are community organization driven, so NGOs that serve the entire city and sometimes the county and the outlying areas. So these are just examples. So AARP, various faith-based organizations, substance abuse councils, landlord associations, all those kinds of things. And then on the bottom is the HOG group, the Lone Wolf chapter, which is, yes, a Harley-Davidson group. And what they do is fundraisers and public awareness and those sorts of things to provide support to the cop shops and to the communities. And so sometimes a lot of what emerges when you get into the community is an extension of groups and people who provide support that one might not traditionally expect to do so, but they do it very well. And then you have your usual, on the right-hand side, the agency-driven government institutions. So who do you partner with at the state and county level that can provide that support that you need for a holistic, community-based approach to supervision? And that includes police departments, prosecutors' offices, Department of Social and Health Services, community colleges, public schools, code enforcement. And so what Spokane experienced is that when they put community corrections officers at the neighborhood level was that they responded to a real mixture of calls that included the obvious, which are offender-centered in terms of visiting offenders in the field and moving forward with that, and number of contacts and those kinds of things, but also an increased number of calls in which the community became engaged and contacted community corrections officers. So out of the cop shops last year, the CCO calls in terms of responding to the community exceeded 4,500 calls in terms of contacting neighborhoods, organizations, NGOs, neighbors, community members, volunteers, all of those kinds of things. Okay, so moving towards the end here, if we go to the next slide. So what are the benefits? What are the benefits to the officers, to the community, to the Department of Corrections? And what we find is that in our interviews with neighborhood-based supervision officers, as well as other research that we did, is that there were many pros and cons in terms of the practical aspects of doing neighborhood-based supervision and locating people or officers in that community. Is that it really enhanced relationships with offenders as well as agencies and knowledge about the community. So officers really felt like they had a good grasp on where their offenders were, what were the challenges that confronted them, what were the supports and the strengths, right? All that collective efficacy and social capital that surrounded them. They also believed that it improved their image. So probation and parole officers felt that their visibility improved and the community began to understand the importance of their role to the criminal justice system as well as to the community. They experienced less stress because they really felt they weren't alone in terms of dealing with people. They had the community with them oftentimes, and so that helped reduce stress in terms of dealing with offender risk. And they also felt that their work was such within the Department of Corrections that they would be backed in a lawsuit, that their decision-making was respected, and that there was a more holistic approach, and so that they would be more likely to be supported by the agency if there was some negative event that occurred. But then there's that reality, and that is the whole issues of caseloads and offenders and community contact not built into evaluations. So what happens is that oftentimes officers, they still have caseloads and workloads that are significant, and then we add on the integration into the community and all those partners and contacts and nurturing those relationships that are necessary to create change and integration with the community, and that adds a burden to their work. And also, not all communities are going to be open-armed in terms of accepting community corrections officers, and so that takes additional work to build trust and to get connections. And they also found that a lot of the people they were partnering with were also overstressed. So they had huge caseloads and workloads, so they didn't necessarily have the capacity to partner with community corrections because they were already above and beyond their capacity to deal with the population in general. And then mission distortion, so who do you work with? So when community corrections officers work primarily with the police, do they become too much like the police and only using their coercive power in terms of arrest and terminating supervision? Or, you know, if they work more holistic with multiple agencies like DSHS and community stakeholders and NGOs, are they able to provide more of a balanced perspective? So on the next slide and the final slide, so what does the agency gain? What the agency gains is strategic deployment. So which oftentimes relates to efficiency. So instead of traveling all over the city and county to make contact and supervise people, everyone is centrally located within a neighborhood. That shared responsibility with other agencies and resource providers, greater access to resources by police, jails, DSHS, and those kinds of things, less crime. But agencies need to prepare for innovation. So often they just kind of add innovation without preparing for that implementation. And so things to consider is how do you institutionalize new practices over time so that you don't get mission distortion or drift. How do you manage liability when you increase contact with the community on multiple levels? And then really sustaining that professional autonomy. So how do you remain the Department of Corrections and Community Corrections and Probation and Parole? How do you sustain that autonomy without and still work with all of these other agencies? So that in a snapshot is the research in terms of the importance of considering communities and corrections of place. And how one example in the state of Washington in terms of how they implemented neighborhood-based supervision. And so, Nathan, I'll now turn it over to you and Scott. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Faith. And now, as she just mentioned, I'll turn it over to Scott Maurer, who will discuss the virtual offices concept, how they've integrated it in the state of Georgia, among other initiatives that they've been working on the last couple of years. Scott?
Thank you, Nathan, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. And I want to start off by saying that our presentation today is certainly not meant to be a how-to guide or anything along those lines as far as virtual offices, but we just wanted to take an opportunity to share with you some of the things that we've implemented in Georgia, why we implemented them, and where we're headed in the future. And to start that off, I know that there's many states are very different in the way adult and juvenile supervision is structured, and so I just wanted to share briefly with you a little bit about the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles. And we are an independent state agency. The parole board itself is made up of 5 board members, and they're appointed by the governor to staggered 7-year terms. Geographically, we cover the entire state. There's 5 regional areas that were broken into about 47 districts and sub-offices. There are total, within the department or the parole board, there's about 655 total employees. You can see the breakdown there of how many chiefs and assistant chiefs we have and parole officers. The remaining staff is administrative staff, and then we have a second division. There's our clemency division, and that division is the one that processes all the pardons and paroles from the prison system. We're currently supervising nearly 25,000 active adult parolees under supervision, and again, these are all adult parolees. The next couple slides I have are actually a very brief overview of neighborhood-based supervision or community supervision, and Faith did an excellent job reviewing the research and literature on neighborhood supervision, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these 2 slides, but I just wanted to point out that when we initially started to talk about this virtual office concept, one of the things that we kept coming back to was there was a lot of research out there that had been done already that stated that supervision from parole officers or probation officers should take place in the community, and that it's best done when those officers are able to connect with local resources, local law enforcement, local faith-based providers, community resources, and we started to take that into consideration with many of our policy decisions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in the next couple of slides. But of course, you see here there's some research that Pew did in the past on community supervision, and the APPA also did some research on community supervision. And so after looking at research and reviewing research, there's a number of things that happened in Georgia that we're kind of calling the perfect storm. A number of things that happened all at once in reference to certain things taking place in order for us to be virtual. And one of the very first things that happened was there was a fair amount of leadership change within our agency. And when that leadership changed, as in most of the time when leadership changes, we began to look at, different ways of doing things and analyzing whether or not we were being the most efficient and effective agency that we could. And one of the things that we started noticing or talking about was, this focus on keeping our officers in the field, supervising their cases in the field, and focusing our resources on our highest risk offenders. And so our supervision approach to our parolees started to change slightly in that we were finding alternatives for some of our lower risk offenders or our lowest risk offenders and focusing our resources in the field on our higher risk offenders. We're currently utilizing a company and a software called Antitrax that our lowest risk offenders can be put in a call-in status, and so that we're able to shift our low risk offenders to that program, which allows us to supervise and focus our supervision efforts on our highest risk offenders. Again, we looked at all the research on community supervision and best practices. And then about the same time as the leadership change and us kind of refocusing and tooling our supervision efforts for parolees in Georgia, we had a group of legislators as well as our executive director and some directors from other agencies went to Maryland and attended a seminar on justice reinvestment in criminal justice reform. And those two things became very important as we started to move forward with our proposal to make our parole officers virtual and, as we'll see in a few slides here, start closing parole offices. Another thing that took place about that same time was as we started to change our philosophy on supervision, one of the first things that our new leadership did is eliminated the required report days that we previously had. So previously there was one day a month that every parolee was required to report to their local parole office. And some offices made 2 days of reporting, but for the most part it was one day. It was usually the first, if I recall, Monday or Tuesday of the month. And, you would have hundreds of parolees reporting to that parole office, the lobby full of people. At times in some offices there were parolees sitting there for hours waiting to see their parole officer. You come back into the office and there was that, 15 or 20 seconds of the same 5 questions you always ask. Do you live in the same place? Are you working in the same place? Have you had any contact with law enforcement? Have you used any drugs? I'll see you next month kind of thing. And then they were also required to do office or visits in the field during that month. But the report day itself to us and to our leadership was somewhat of a waste of our parole officers' time as well as a waste of the parolees' time, and that they had to take time off work if they were employed to come down there and report. So in any case, we eliminated report days, and as we're traveling around the state to visit all of these offices on a regular basis, we walk into an office and it would be empty, or there would be 2 or 3 people there. And we certainly began to realize that, we're paying leases in all these offices across the state. We're telling our officers that they need to be out in the field doing supervision, and when we go to the office, that's exactly what they were doing. And so we're paying thousands or millions of dollars in lease space across the state for empty offices. So that was kind of all those things coming together in the Criminal Justice Reform Council. came to Georgia. The governor wanted to focus on criminal justice reform in Georgia. He put a council together that consisted of people from the judiciary, the prosecutors, there was legislators on there, also people from various agencies that are directly involved in criminal justice in Georgia. And their focus for the first year was on the prison population and also on alternatives to incarceration. And so there were a number of recommendations that Reform Council made, and one of them was that they encouraged the state to find where they could capture potential savings, and that some of that savings that the state could realize through alternatives to incarceration be reinvested into options that have been proven to reduce recidivism. And of course, when you reduce recidivism, you're always increasing public safety. So this is kind of where we started having the very beginnings of the virtual offices. All these different things kind of coupled together at the same time. Our change in supervision strategies, our elimination of report days, visiting offices and realizing that they were actually empty offices, and then the governor's office and the Criminal Justice Reform Council asking for us to identify ways to reduce costs, and kind of giving us almost the green light to, where we could prove it to be effective, reinvest that money into other programs. So the next step for us, of course, was we needed to determine, if we were to close parole offices around the state, could our parole officers do their job from their vehicle, from their home, or in the community. And, of course, did a lot of office visits and surveys of our staff in the field. And really, we got a lot of recommendations back from the field, but really what those recommendations focused on was they needed to be able to access our offender management system or our case management system wirelessly and from wherever they're at. They needed to be able to print and scan documents, obviously, and the ability to conduct hearings or administrative hearings and video conferences with not only staff but also potentially with their parolees. So, ironically, one of the things that we've realized in the very beginning was that we were very close to being able to provide our officers the ability to work virtually with the equipment we already had in the field. We had for a long time already been issuing laptops to our officers. We had also established the VPN networks on all their computers. And so we started looking at different equipment options that would help them be even more successful in being able to do their job from pretty much anywhere they were at. And the last kind of shoe to drop on us was our initial proposal was that we were going to, over a 3-year period, we would eliminate the majority of our office space where we are paying a lease, and that we would use that money over that 3-year period to reinvest into things like vehicles, into whether it be tablets or Chromebooks or technology that would allow our officers to be more effective and able to conduct their jobs from the field. And then also reinvest some of that money not only into our equipment but also into expanding day reporting centers in Georgia. The very first pilot that we did was in the site in the south part of the state where there was 2 buildings sitting side by side. One was a probation office and one was a parole office. And our initial proposal there was that if we were successful in going virtual, that we could empty one of those offices and turn that into a day reporting center, which is essentially a drug and mental health treatment program. It's a 6-month program where parolees and probationers can be referred for intensive outpatient treatment services. And so as we started to propose our initial project plan and our strategic plan on virtualizing our offices, our FY13 budget requirement was that we were going to be required by the governor's office to take a 3% budget reduction. And so that was significant because as we started to look at our strategic plan to virtualize our parole officers and close offices, we realized that there was really only 2 options that we had. One was to turn our 3-year plan into a 1-year plan, and with the potential cost savings through leases and equipment of a little over $1 million. Or the second option would have been to furlough staff. And a lot of the staff that we would have had to furlough would have been in our clemency division that processes cases, which would have impacted releases. And clearly and obviously we did not want to have to exercise the option of furloughing our staff. So collectively we kind of put together a plan to take what was a 3-year plan and turn it into a 1-year plan. So I say all to tell you that as we go through the rest of the presentation, we had kind of somewhat gotten put in a situation where we had to put the cart before the horse, whereas if we had 3 years, we could have established some policies and procedures a little bit spread over a 3-year period where we only we had to shorten that down to a year. And we are just about 4 months over that year period right now. So next thing we had to do policy issue-wise, was we, of course, had to get legislative approval for us to keep the money that we saved by closing offices and lease and reinvest that into equipment and technology in order for our officers to be virtual. We closed all the existing offices, or the majority of the existing offices that we were paying leases in. We realized that we had a number of officers that were going to need vehicles. At the time, we didn't have enough vehicles, obviously, for every officer in the state. Initially, we proposed that we would purchase vehicles so that every officer had a vehicle. We then realized that we could actually be more economical and productive and efficient if we assigned 2 officers to a vehicle so that they can either ride in the community together or that could be available to one of them when the other one is working, not necessarily in the field. We also had to, of course, establish policies around developing home offices. And ironically, here in Georgia, we had about at the same time a very big push from the governor's office on a clean air campaign. And they put out a number of policies and overviews on how to implement work away or work from home initiatives in your agencies. And so we used a lot of the guidance that the Clean Air Campaign was already giving us on establishing, home offices and the ability to work virtually. And then there was, of course, management issues. And this, probably the biggest policy and or management issue that we had going forward was not necessarily the parole officers in the field, because they were already working in the field, and they were used to working in the field, and they knew they had access to our case management system from the field. But the management staff, kind of losing that, everybody's coming in the office every morning to control, and so there was quite a bit of training we had to go through with the management staff on how they were going to be able to manage their employees. And one of the things technology-wise that we identified early on is that we needed to identify technology that would allow for our management staff to supervise their officers in a virtual setting. And one of the things that we did is moved off of a old Lotus Notes platform for email to Google Government accounts. And within Google Government, we had the ability to use Hangouts. And so one of the ways now that our chief parole officers and our assistant chief parole officers are communicating with their staff in the field is through the utilization of Google Hangouts. And we'll talk a little bit more about some other technologies we identified going forward. Of course, our emphasis is always going to be on, first and foremost, public safety and our supervision being in the community. We developed parole supervision teams based on 2 officers to a vehicle. We already covered the fact that we eliminated all the report days across the state. And, one of the things that we found very important in rolling this out to the field was that, it's no longer the parolee coming to you for stuff. It was the parole officer actually going to the parolee, to their house, to their place of business, and familiarizing themselves with what was in that community. And this is where, and if we had 3 years to implement this project, we would have focused much more on developing this neighborhood, community-based partners prior to deploying our officers into those areas and kind of putting them geographically in a neighborhood and saying, this is your neighborhood, you're going to supervise the parolees in this area. But after implementation, after about 6 months, we realized that those officers and those chiefs in those different districts around the state were doing probably a far better job than we could have done administratively from the leadership positions in developing community partnerships. It didn't take very long after we told staff and a chief in a district that we were going to close their office that it was, with a very relatively short amount of time, they had already made arrangements for places where they could go, sheriff's department or a local police department or a probation office where they were willing to give them office space if somebody needed to come to an office, or a conference room if they needed to have a meeting. And so across the state in a very short amount of time, our officers and our chiefs were able to develop many different partnerships, and it grows every day with either local law enforcement, local community providers, local faith-based organizations. And this is where the whole neighborhood-based supervision is starting to take effect, because those officers are in the field all day, every day, and they're assigned to geographic locations, and they're becoming more and more familiar with what's available in that area. And then the last thing was, of course, to continue to increase the use of technology. I mentioned earlier that we had already deployed laptops to our officers, but we realized in the very beginning that we were going to have to continually find technology that would make our officers' jobs, while virtual, even easier. So one of the things we had to do immediately was give, all our officers at the time when we decided to virtualize our offices had what, for lack of a better term, a dumb phone. Nobody had smartphones, and so we had to deploy several hundred smartphones to the field, which instantly gave our officers access to their email, to Google Chat, which we used quite a bit to communicate, to their calendars, to their email. And then we have been steadily testing out a number of different products, as far as from tablets to Chromebooks, to identify what the best device is going to be in the field. And the frustrating, or the part of that, is that it seems like every probably 3 to 4 months a new or better device comes out. So Google has actually been extremely helpful in helping us identify a number of different devices. They've actually gave us to pilot a couple hundred Chromebooks. So we have some Chromebooks deployed right now in the field. And the advantage of those for the officers is those Chromebooks boot in about 10 seconds. And so initially they were having trouble with their laptops, where they would go into a house to do a home visit, and by the time they came back out and their partner was logging into our case management system, they had been timed out, so you have to go back through the login process. And so this is making that a lot less painful for them. But, we could probably spend another half an hour talking about just technology that we've had to test or implement. But for the most part, the big pieces were, access to the case management system virtually, giving them a smartphone, and then changing from Lotus Notes email system to Google Government, which has given us a tremendous amount of flexibility in the ability to work virtually. Of course, our desired outcomes and the performance measures that we focused on from the beginning is, and I mentioned one earlier already, but always public safety first, but to focus on and continue to work on partnerships and developing resources within the community that are reentry based. And ironically, the Criminal Justice Reform Council that I had mentioned earlier 3 years ago focused on the prison population and alternatives to incarceration. Year 2, last year, their main focus was on the juvenile justice system. And this year, the governor has announced the committee's focus is going to be on reentry. So it's kind of a perfect time for us to be implementing this virtual office concept in community-based supervision, because of the focus from all state agencies through the Criminal Justice Reform Council will now be on, for the next year at least, on how can we set up a reentry system statewide that is more efficient and effective than what we currently have in place. Increasing our successful completion rates is always going to be one of our driving performance measures. And one of the other things, and I'll show you a slide here in a minute, but very early on we've noticed that there's been an increase in are meaningful contacts or collateral contacts. And so our officers are going out in the field not just seeing the offender one-on-one, but they're also seeing, mom, dad, girlfriend, their employer, because of the amount of time they're spending in those neighborhoods and in those communities. We expect to see an increase in employment as our officers are in the field, more familiar with what resources are close by, who's hiring. They should have the time now to actually stop in some places that have a sign out front saying now hiring and talk to them about the potential of hiring offenders and some of the tax incentives that go along with that. Increased participation in treatment. We feel strongly that there are a number of providers in the community that we just don't know about, that we haven't had contact or any kind of partnership with in the past. That as our officers are out in the field and in those communities will be able to develop, more, it could be anywhere from a faith-based AA meeting to, a community provider that's local. And I think the other advantage there is that as we, in my days of supervision, I had a list of maybe 5 or 6 places that did substance abuse treatment, and I would refer people to those programs. Well, for some folks, it might have been, on the other side of the county for them to go there and get treatment. But those were the only ones that I knew about. Now if we can identify providers that are close within that neighborhood or within that community, officers can begin referring people to those programs. Reducing violations and revocations, and then of course, as I said, it's always, the number one concern is always going to be on public safety. We here, in the sake of time, we'll quickly go through these, but here's some of the partnerships that we had in place or have developed in the past year. Some of these are state and local law enforcement agencies, and a lot of partnerships that we've developed with our Department of Corrections and probation operations, and utilizing some state offices. So we currently now have, I think, 5 offices or 4 offices that we're actually paying a lease in. We have another 6 or 7 where we're sharing space in state-owned property with Department of Corrections probation operations, and we've closed in around 33 or 34 offices. So that is where we stand today. The 14 brick-and-mortar offices you see on that slide right now are kind of our footprint across the state, and one of the things that a lot of times we've gotten questions about, well, what if an officer has to go to an officer? What if you're having some kind of regional training or something? Where do you do that at? So we did maintain a much smaller footprint of offices that are available to staff and to supervisors when needed. But again, out of the 14, what we're calling brick-and-mortar offices, there's only 4 or 5 that we're actually paying in a lease in now. And so that resulted in about $1 million, a little over $1 million savings to us. And again, we were able to reinvest those funds this year into vehicles and equipment. But going forward, that's the savings to the state. So one of the things that we've noticed early on in offices that have been virtual for 6 months, if we compare just a couple simple things here, face-to-face contacts, parole completions, and parole revocations, the prior 6 months and then the 6 months after being virtual, you'll see that there's been a fairly significant increase in face-to-face contacts. Our parole completions have pretty much stayed the same in those offices, and our parole revocations have gone down slightly. Now, I know that's a very short period of time to try to justify any performance measures or outcomes at this time, but what we feel those things are pointing to is that there's certainly a trend moving in the right direction, and it's not going in the opposite direction. So we're very encouraged with the results we're seeing so far as it relates to parole completions, contacts, and parole revocations. And this is just kind of where we're moving in the future. We're, as I mentioned before, looking to increase our meaningful contacts. And when we say meaningful contacts, a contact is more than just the officer asking the parolee if anything's changed. Increasing community resources and partnerships, of course, reducing recidivism. Swifter sanctions is another thing that in the previous slide, we don't have anything on that, but we've noticed in our data that the time between violation and sanction is reducing fairly significantly since we've been virtual. And if you compare it to offices where in the previous 6 months what their time between violation and sanction were, we are showing some decreases in that amount of time in those offices that have been virtual for at least 6 months. We will continue to work on technology solutions. Our focus for the Criminal Justice Reform Council this year is going to be on reentry, and of course that, being in the parole business, that's what we do. And so we'll be heavily involved in the Criminal Justice Reform Council over these next 12 months in their reentry efforts. And then, networking through, assigning our officers to specific locations, neighborhoods, communities where the majority of our parolees live. And with that, I will end now, and I guess we will spend the rest of our time, Nathan, answering any questions.
Yeah, you bet, Scott, and thank you for your portion as well. I think that's a concise overview of what you all been able to do with virtual offices. And again, thank you to Faith for the overview of really the theoretical and practical applications, really putting it into perspective of what we're talking about here with neighborhood-based supervision. Fortunately, attendees have submitted a number of questions, so I think we'll begin with this one, and this is really, I think, geared towards for you, Faith. A few questions were asked about how really the concept or the practice of neighborhood-based supervision relates to restorative justice as a practice, specifically in regard to successful reintegration of offenders in the community, society as a whole, moving away from the offender status and moving into that full reintegration. So you have a response to that, Faith?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The intention of neighborhood-based supervision was to really give a more holistic approach to supervision and to look at long-term reintegration. So really, how do you restore someone to the community and allow the community to engage the offender not just as an offender, but as an active, valuable member of that community. And so by linking resources and partnering with those neighborhood level organizations and individuals and people and stakeholders, right, at the block level and at that neighborhood level, really allows for a more holistic approach so that it's really balancing a more fluid response of support and treatment and engagement, but not forgetting, as Scott has mentioned in his presentation, that community safety element, because people have to feel safe in order to engage anyone in the community, whether it's offenders or not. And so restorative justice is an important theoretical as well as practical aspect of community-based supervision because it's a much more holistic, inclusive response versus working with people in isolation.
Great, good deal. And I suspect, although it seems like today's talk was geared more towards adult offenders, I mean, this is certainly something, a practice that could be applied with juvenile offenders in the community. I think of, a number of juvenile-oriented programs. I think Boston Operation Nightlight is similar to that, in which, really the idea is to have officers or case managers out in the community, seeing what kids are doing in the community, touching base with neighbors, family members, but it's certainly applicable to juvenile offenders as well. Would you say that, Faith?
Yeah, that's true. Because once again, it's and Scott highlighted this as well, is that when our probation and parole officers are out in the community, they're able to see how everyone is interacting and connecting around a variety of activities, both criminal as well as positive activities like school and sport and recreation. And so I really do believe it's applicable across age.
Awesome. Now, Scott, a number of questions have come up about the virtual offices and how it's being used, specifically what types of offenders. So could you elaborate on, to give, maybe give the audience a sense of how many and what types of offenders are currently being supervised under the virtual offices concept? The specialized populations, high-risk folks, or is it really just applicable to all types of parolees?
It's a good question. It is applicable to all types of parolees. The offices that I showed in the map that are still brick and mortar offices that are not offices where parolees or a certain parole district have an office. Those are offices where officers from that entire region can use it. So at this point, all of our officers are virtual, and so whether you're supervising a specialized caseload like sex offenders, people on EM, or high-risk caseload, they're all of our officers are virtual. All of our officers are virtual. So in instances like, for example, with electronic monitoring where you need to be able to set equipment up and stuff like that, that's where those either local partnerships or some of those existing brick-and-mortar offices come in handy. They can utilize those offices to meet with their offender if they need to swap out equipment. That's also, for example, where they'll conduct a drug screen. If they find that their parolee needs to have a drug screen, they can report to whatever those local partnerships are. It might be a sheriff's department or one of our brick-and-mortar offices, and do those types of activities there. But as far as what type of supervision, this applies to all types of supervision. I hope that answers the question.
Certainly, and kind of a follow-up to that question, another attendee asked about maybe the types of training, whether you all had to provide special training either around the use of firearms, cognitive skills, or just any change in practice that officers had to undergo, training in to better orient themselves around this neighborhood-based supervision approach.
So there's been an increase in training from our training unit as it relates to being in the field and situations they might get in the field. But all of our officers upon hire have to go through an 8-week basic training for a parole officer training academy. And during that academy, they're all certified with firearms, certified with tasers, certified with batons. That's all equipment that they carry every day. But they're also, during that training, trained on motivational interviewing, MRT, and some of the other cognitive behavioral approaches to supervision. And so all of our officers come out of that academy with that training, and then we conduct on an annual basis in-service training that are refreshers on whether it be a cognitive behavioral approach to supervision or those issues that are related to officer safety in the field.
Yeah, it just seems like you would have to provide some training to kind of orient them to this new type of practice with the technology and just kind of the basic, the basic logistics of it all. But
and there's been a lot of training that we've had to do on technology. Switching to Google Government but to be honest with you, a lot of the training that we're doing now through Google, our Google Government accounts can be done via either Hangouts or they can be done through videos that we can post to our internal website that officers can go in at their convenience and watch it. If it's new equipment they're receiving, they can watch a short video on how to use that equipment. But training will always be one of our highest priorities as far as in service and continuing to train our officers on equipment and technology that we're putting out in the field.
Certainly. And this is, I think, really a question that either one of you could address. I'll let you all make that determination. But a question came up about, the idea of trying to get the buy-in from the community, whether it's really at the local, within the local level, and within neighborhoods themselves, but getting successful suggestions or a couple of successful strategies that could be noted that could help in getting that community buy-in, because one attendee in particular indicated that they reside in work in a rural area where there's low collective efficacy, limited resources, and those resources tend to be provided with the folks who don't have criminal records, and so there's an issue of resources and just really the perception of offenders or those involved in the justice system. So what are some key strategies to getting the community buy-in from an agency standpoint?
Scott, maybe I'll start this one and you can follow up. Well, I think what happens, and especially when you talk about neighborhood-based supervision as it's implemented in Spokane, which, by the way, is a mid-sized city surrounded by extensive rural communities. And as what Scott is talking about, I think once officers get out into the community and working directly with community members, those resources become visible, where before they were invisible. Once you get out there, you start to see, oh, this faith-based organization is doing this work, and this, other organization is also doing this work, or there's a citizen group or a community center, or there's leaders within the community who are making that outreach. And so that's where you look for that connection, that collective efficacy. And then sometimes, our agencies have the power to assist create that collective efficacy. So if there's an absence of something in the community, to try to garner the resources to make that available. So it is a challenge for sure, but there usually is some element of support out there that we're oftentimes not aware of because we haven't looked before.
Yeah, and Scott, if you have any additional, we just got about a minute or two.
I honestly, to sum it up very shortly, I think that the presence in the community is what gets that started. When officers start spending more time in those communities, they begin to familiarize themselves with what resources are there, and people are more willing to talk to them once they've seen them in the community frequently.
And if I can follow up, and seeing the officer in the community, not just when they're arresting someone, but when they're supporting someone, because oftentimes the only time they're seen, oftentimes in criminal justice, is when there's a negative event happening. But when they start seeing them present, when there's positive things happening, that's when the connections start to build.
Great. Well, I think that's certainly, I know there's some other questions that are still filling in, but if you have any individual questions that you would like to send any of the two panelists, their email address is listed on this slide. Hopefully you've written that down. If not, certainly you can access the slides in a PDF file and just contact them individually. They'd be more happy to address any of your additional questions or issues or concerns you may have. And at this time, I'll just turn it back over to Sean to conclude the webinar for today.
All right. Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Faith and Scott, for this very informative webinar today. This concludes today's webinar. After you exit the webinar, a brief survey will appear on your screen. By answering the questions in the survey, you will be helping the Resource Center improve on the services we offer. We greatly appreciate it if you would take just a few minutes to complete the survey. We will email a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a link to a PDF of the PowerPoint slides used in the presentation. And later, well, it won't be later this week, it'll be next week when we get that email out. These links will also be made available on the National Reentry Resource Center's website, which is csgjusticecenter.org/